So, after being changed right after the PTS release, Izanami just got changed again. This time, however, it's a buff, and it's actually a solid buff right there. So what happened? On-hit effects stay exactly the same. You're not gonna stack Veil twice in one hit, you're not gonna stack Executioner twice in one hit, Odysseus' bow is not gonna stack any faster, the proc's not gonna come off any faster. However, crit was changed. More specifically, the on-crit effects. As you remember, in the first version on the PTS, you were able to crit twice on one hit. However, only the first basic attack, the first swing of the attack, was able to proc on-hit effects of crits. The second effect was just there. It had an interesting interaction with rage because you could crit on the second hit without actually losing the stacks of rage, but it kinda was glitchy in that regard and didn't really work the same way as a normal basic attack. Now, exactly this has been changed. Izanami can now crit on both parts of the basic attack swing again, but not only that, the second part of the attack, the second hit with the weapon, will also trigger crit on-hit effects, and it will be able to crit again. So now you can get 2 stacks of rage in one single attack. Before we go into the item builds, let's look at some interactions with items, how these are changed and how this impacts certain items in her kit. Executioner, as you can see here, applies on the first part of the basic attack, so for the second part of the basic, the damage is already applied. Concise still works the same as it worked before. It will proc on the first swing that connects to the target. Ikaivel, once again, doesn't double stack, however, on the second swing, it already has the increased damage like Executioner. As before, if you don't connect the first hit, the backswing will always apply all the effects that you have. Now let's look at the crit items. Rage actually doesn't really have an impact on its own. It procs twice as often, but it also deals half the damage on a crit. You will see a lot of crit numbers, but the numbers aren't really high, so while it's nice for extra crits, on its own, it's not impactful. It's in synergy with other crit items that Rage becomes really potent now. The same concept kinda goes for Deathbringer. Even if you have 2 chances to crit per basic attack, the damage is not really much higher. You can see the damage value here of 266 per crit. Malice is where stuff gets interesting. As you can see here, the crit damage is obviously slightly lower as it is with Deathbringer. However, you get that dot in the background. A single tick of the dot from Malice, as it still scales with full power and is not halved, will already outdamage the extra damage from Deathbringer. Keep in mind that Malice will deal multiple ticks of damage if you don't crit again. So DPS-wise, Malice is the better choice most of the time, unless you have a ridiculous amount of crit. Having a ridiculous amount of crit on Izanami brings up some pretty interesting numbers above the character, because basically half of your attacks are crits, and if you attack twice per attack, then that's gonna be a lot of crits. And talking about a lot of crits, here's one thing that doesn't need that. Wind Demon. By simply hitting a basic attack on the wave, you're pretty much guaranteed to proc the Wind Demon passive, because you hit 12 hits in total, meaning you have a very high chance to proc the passive. Now that all of that is done, let us take a look at Izanami build version 3. A lot has changed since the last version, especially the fact that Transcendence is completely removed. Why is that so? With a new build, you want to get to crit as soon as possible, simply because it is really potent for Izanami now. That's why you're starting Death Toll, so you get some sustain with the built-in healing and some mana return, and obviously get a quicker power spike going into your boots. Building Transcendence would just unnecessarily delay your crit, and you don't really want that to happen. So you're starting Death Toll, then you're going into Warrior Tabi, simply because you can still benefit from the high power early when the game is more focused on ability damage, and then that can be traded out later, but we get to that. After that, you're building Ikaival simply because it gives you even more power, it gives you great boxing potential, it gives you some attack speed and penetration, flat penetration, which are stats that you are going to need in this build because you're not getting too much of those otherwise, and that way you have a really good early in terms of boxing, especially when it comes to your overall power, in combination with some sustain. After that, we're going straight into crit. We're starting off with Rage, simply because it gives you so much crit early on, and with her double strikes, you will be able to proc on hits much more effectively. Keep in mind that at this point, there is no actual benefit in having Rage in regards to the damage, so this is a point where you try not to trade too much. You could build Malice right away, but it's just very, very expensive and usually not worth it. With the amounts of crits you're doing this early into the game, you will have no problems clearing lane at all, though. You can save your mana for poke, which is great in that situation, that point of the game, so you will have a lot more room to bully. Next, you're gonna finish Malice. As shown before, Malice has a lot of DPS over Deathbringer at the moment, unless you're having a lot of crit. So in this regard, Malice is the way to go, and it will allow you to box immensely well at this point of the game. You can be certain that at that point you will have teamfights, you will have boxing, and for that, the power spike that you're getting out of the combination of Rage and Malice on this particular character is just great. You don't necessarily need to focus down a character, just going in to poke a little bit can help your team greatly, as if you just throw a single basic, you're pretty likely to at least crit once and have that Malice dot on a target, meaning you already deal massive amounts of damage to that one player. At this point, things become a little bit wonky. So far, I was always amongst the ones saying that Titan's Bane should be valued over Executioner here, because she has that really high ability damage, that high scaling on her ultimate and on her too. However, I also think that with the new build and with the increased chance of crit, you're gonna rely on your basic attacks a lot more than before. Also, this kit overall, this item build overall will not have too much attack speed. And getting that extra attack speed from Executioner here is great in that regard. I will still leave it open to you. You can abuse the steroid on the one a lot in order to get the attack speed that way. And try and make it work that way, but I will point out that at this point, I think both options are viable compared to before where only Titan's Bane was really an option. Now, Executioner has its place simply for the higher DPS that you get in combination with a crit build. This brings us to the bottom row. The first thing that's going to be traded out is Death Toll. This should be very obvious. You're not going to keep that late game. And what you're getting for it is Wind Demon, or you could also get Poison Star. We'll talk about that in a second. The great thing with Wind Demon is that you can proc it in a wave as shown, so you can be sure to pretty much always have that passive up, which is great just to chase down targets and have that extra attack speed, which this build kind of needs. For even more attack speed, you can trade out Warrior Tabi and go for Ninja Tabi. This is a bit of personal preference. It will give you some more DPS, but you will lose some ability damage. Once again, I think at this point, crits in the basics are more important than ability damage, so I would prefer the attack speed. The Kaivel is still really useful, and you can theoretically keep the item even at this point. I think it's still very, very strong in the late game now, especially on Izanami, if you need some flat penetration. Another option that I would highly recommend here is Asi. I originally didn't recommend Asi on her at all. I thought it was one of the worst lifesteal items that you can get. However, things have changed a little bit. As she builds triple crit now, Asi has a lot more benefit, or lifesteal in general has a lot more benefit, as it scales very well with crit, as you still get that double healing. As you will eventually need some lifesteal, or often need some lifesteal, Asi is good here, as it gives you the stats that Kaivel has, and the lifesteal, minus some extra power. You still get some flat penetration, you get some attack speed, and you have that passive, which you can abuse as well. If you use your basic attacks in the normal way in the beginning of a fight, and then when you drop low, start using your steroid in order to heal up, it can work very well, and you can actually surprise your opponent with the amount of healing you're doing all of a sudden. This doesn't have to be done, but it can be done. The last item that can be traded out, or should be traded out rather, is Rage. Rage is very, very good for the initial crit chance, just to get that extra crit chance up, in order to proc Malice reliably. However, in late game, it's not quite as important anymore. As you will crit a lot anyways with triple crit, it's kinda a bit of a downside if you crit too much, as Malice will just dot a lot less. Your basics will just crit over and over again, so sometimes you will not get a single tick from Malice. With this build, you will still have 60% crit chance at this point, which is more than enough to reliably tick at least one crit per basic attack, as you have a 60% chance twice. Sometimes it will happen that you won't actually crit, but it's very, very unlikely. And when you crit, you just hit so much harder if you have both a Deathbringer and Malice. Now let's take a quick look at the situationals. There is Kinsai's, which still procs on the first swing. It's great if you think you can't reliably hit both basic attacks. I think that in this build, or in the concept of this build, it's typically better to just go triple crit and maximize your damage that way, but it's very much possible to just go for Kinsai's instead, and for example trade out Wind Demon for it, so you get your extra DPS against tanky targets that way. The other item that's worth mentioning is Poison Star. Poison Star is usually relatively weak simply because it doesn't proc as often as it should have to in order to be effective with the 2-second long passive of the item. However, on Izanami you can actually proc it reliably. This means that you can make a lot more use of the item than most other hunters can. I personally would still prefer Wind Demon most of the time, especially due to the advantage that you can proc it on other targets on a minion wave, and that it gives you extra attack speed, which is just so helpful in this build. But I will absolutely not dismiss Poison Star in that regard. It definitely has its place. It can be built instead of Deathbringer, just as a third crit item, as a cheap option, or it can just replace Wind Demon if you prefer it that way. Both are viable choices and should also be partially made depending on the situation. If there's a lot of damage dealt against you, then obviously it makes sense to get an item that reduces the damage dealt against you. In that regard, Wind Demon is just not quite as great as Poison Star. Before we end the video, there was one quick thing that was pointed out by TagXL on Reddit that I wanted to tell you guys, which is you can actually target Izanamemes too the way that you target Ola's axes. So after aiming, you can still readjust your aim while the ability is thrown out if you turn to the side. I think this is really helpful to get used to the character in order to aim better with her, so I figured I'd let you guys know as well. So shoutouts to him or her for pointing that out. That brings us to the end of the video. The fan art drawn here was made by Ellie. Feel free to check out that Twitter profile if you got Twitter. Thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you all tomorrow for the next video. Duke Sloth, out.